Oh yeah, sorry, but I don't know how to get rid of that. When it's something domain general, that's common, we imagine, to all forms of creativity, or domain specific, which is about, domain specific to each particular type of human endeavor there is. Okay, so when we define creativity, it's a hard thing to do, which is why we still debate it. And how we define it matters for understanding changing brains. So we all know the standard definition of creativity, which was kind of beautifully archived by Mark Runco to say, well, we kind of following this implicit definition. Who came up with this first? He and Garrett Yeager figured out that it was Morris Stein in 1953. And they said that there are two elements for something to be considered creative. One is novelty. So that means that whatever the product is did not exist in the same form previously. So you're looking at how far it deviates from the status quo. But that is not enough for an idea to be creative. An idea also must be seen as tenable, useful, or satisfying. Okay. So different people have used different words for this. So in the Runco paper, they use the word effective. Donald McKinnon used the word appropriate. We all see these as interchangeable terms for appropriateness, effective, and so on. I don't think it's necessarily the case, but we have to generalize in many ways. And this is sort of seen as a standard definition of creativity. Creativity is that sweet spot where a novel idea meets appropriateness. And this definition seems to matter regardless of the magnitude of creativity that you're looking at. So to take all of these ideas, little c creativity proposed first by Csikszentmihalyi compared to big C creativity, P creativity versus H creativity proposed by Bowden, she now calls it I creativity. You're basically distinguishing between everyday creativity that little kid showed, individual psychological creativity, versus the kind of creativity that all of us would agree is super novel, okay? Implicit in this is, of course, a kind of continuum that's implicit there. And so you have the really influential work of Kaufman and Beghetto, who came up with a 4C model, which is to say, let's think about magnitude as broken down in a little more nuance, starting from mini c, what that kid was displaying, all the way up to little c as it gets more and more objective, more productive, and finally the kind that changed the world, let's say. It's important to know we all start here at mini c, and what's great about human beings is that we can start any time almost, as long as we have some functional use of our bodies. We can start on any kind of creative task. I don't do any sculpture, but if I wanted to today, I could start, and I would start at mini c. And as I got better and better, perhaps I would go up there. Or maybe not. I'd just stay at little c and mini c and get a lot of benefits out of just being there. Now, there are lots of problems with the standard definition. I'll pick on the researchers that have pointed this out first. Let's take Margaret Bowden, the kind of absolute hero in the field of cognitive science and computational creativity. So she pointed out, for instance, in her definition of creativity, which is that a creative idea must be novel, surprising, and valuable. She talked about the problems she had with this definition. I'm not going to get into all of the problems, but she said, I said earlier that new has two meanings. She's talking about P and H, and surprising has three. I didn't say how many meanings valuable has, and no one could. Our aesthetic values are difficult to recognize, more difficult to put into words, and even more difficult to state clearly. So despite recognizing the problem of this arm of the definition, she left it in her definition. She thought there's something there that has to still remain, even though it's problematic. Let's take another approach. Robert Weisberg, incredibly influential scholar in creativity research. He essentially proposes doing away with the second arm altogether. I forget who it was yesterday. I think it was Todd Lubar who brought up intentionality. That's also what Weisberg believes, which is that creativity is intentional novelty. And again, he goes against the second arm by saying, you know, we should do without it because value is inherently subjective, is subject to large fluctuations historically. Therefore, value is of questionable utility if one hopes to provide a reliable and objective classification of products and the individuals who produce them. And because they change over time, they're not reliable, so we shouldn't use it. That's his role. That's his view. Okay, that's just a smattering of really influential people who has a problem with it. Artists, though, have enormous problems with this definition, as I'm imagining all of us creativity researchers who bump into scholar artists have to deal with this. Let's take Siri Husfeld. I'm picking on artists here who communicate with neuroscientists and psychologists because they want to push us to change things a bit. Let's take Siri Husfeld, a really acclaimed author, very, very prolific. In a sort of panel discussion she had with neuroscientists, psychotherapists, and so on, they talk about all sorts of things, including creativity. in that paper, and it's also a video online. I'm just going to play a little bit from the video, okay? Oh, I hope this works.
And specifically neuroscience.
Sorry, don't know what's going on. Oh, here. Oh, the audio here is on.
The question is, can neuroscience ever
In the arts, which is a pretty low consensus field, is that it matters who the judge is. And that's a problem, because judgments change depending on who's part of the jury. Experts can disagree. Judgments can be faulty or biased, and they can change. And more importantly, for the artists, why they create is, and novelty can really come at the expense of value. Sometimes novelty is the value, and an artist's notions of what is valuable can be very much at odds with society and so on. So this is what he said in his own words: as currently written and applied, the standard definition risks underrepresenting the nonconformist, the marginalized, the amateur, and the child. Taking into account the wide range of creativity from amateur to professional, low consensus fields to high ones, child to adult, and so on, a definition of creativity is more comprehensive and internally consistent when utility, value, usefulness, appropriateness, and fitness are considered secondary attributes rather than primary. And I think the second thing is important for the changing brain side, because he also said, when the making is distinguished from the reception, okay? Let's go back to this. Then she talks about this affective component. The only way an artist knows what's right or what's wrong is through a gut feeling. I'll mute it, don't worry. Yeah, I don't want you to sit uncomfortably the whole time. I can do that. That's just the mouse, right? Yeah, I can do that. Okay, so this and many other things caused me to go look back at the definition recently, and I thought, I think we've maybe sort of zoned in on the wrong part of the definition. This second arm, Morris Stein used three words to describe one vector. And based on a lot of neuroscience work about why we goal-directed behavior when you know how to stop, I was thinking maybe satisfying is the way we should have gone instead. That we create things, a novel idea is one that is original or novel and satisfying. Now, I'm going to go back to Morris Stein to make my case first, okay? So Morris Stein says this: often in studying creativity, we tend to restrict ourselves to the study of the genius because the distance between what he has done and what has existed is quite marked. Such an approach causes us to overlook a necessary distinction between the creative product and the creative experience. The child who fixes the bell on the tricycle for the first time may go through stages that are structurally similar to those which characterize the work of the genius. His finished product, however, is a return to a previously existing state of affairs. In speaking of creativity, therefore, it is necessary to distinguish between internal and external frames of reference, okay? So the internal frame of reference of the creator versus the external frame of reference of the onlooker, the recipient. When we think about magnitudes of creativity, such as the 4Cs model, what we're applying here is an increasingly external lens. The creativity is seen as, let's say, eminent only because it is externally judged as being eminent. And there's a reason, that's a good reason for that. That external lens is there to talk about I versus P and P versus I and so on. But what he's saying is that when it comes to the internal frame of reference, there's not much difference between someone like me in the kitchen and an expert chef like Elena Rogatis. In many ways, there are expertise-based differences, of course, but the way we use our minds, our perceptual systems, our semantic systems, our reasoning systems, and so on, are pretty similar, yeah? So to acknowledge, to use this definition would be a way to accommodate a lot of individual differences in the way we judge creativity as well, because it accommodates the perspective of both the creator and the recipient. The problem for us, though, is that the internal frame of reference of the experiencing person is largely ignored in creativity research, whether it's education, psychology, or neuroscience, yeah? Assessments of creativity are largely based on external raters, or nowadays AI, and not the experiencing person. And what's more, we're using these external ratings to tell us about what the experiencing person was going through, right? So that's me doing something creative, Indra saying, I don't find that particularly creative, but maybe I was going through something quite creative, and vice versa, okay? The other thing that's ignored that's going to be really important, I think, for us going forward, especially given all the focus on co-collaborative creativity we talked about yesterday, is understanding how they're, of course, related to each other, but they are separable. And how they inform one another is going to be really important to understand. But in all this amount of creativity research we've done, we really haven't explored how the external frame of reference informs and shapes the internal frame of reference, perhaps. But that's because we've used it to substitute one for the other. There's lots of people who've made a case for this. I'm not going to present this video of him, but this is a wonderful book that really talks entirely about the internal frame of reference of creating. But I'm just going to jump to some psychologists who've talked about this a long time ago. The humanist Carl Rogers says, perhaps the most fundamental condition of creativity is that the source or locus of evaluation of the judgment is internal. The value of the product for the creative person is established not by the praise and criticism of others, but by himself. Have I created something satisfying to me? Does it express a part of me, my feeling, or my thought, my pain, or my ecstasy? This does not mean that he is oblivious to or unwilling to be aware of the judgments of others. If to the person it has the feel of being me in action, of being an actualization of potentialities in himself, which heretofore have not existed and are now emerging into existence, then it is satisfying in creativity. And no outside judgment can fundamentally change that fact. So the whole point is to say it starts here before it gets evaluated by others. And others might not think that this is very good, but that does not mean that you have not had some form of transformative experiences. Lots of people have pointed this out. Let me jump now to make the case, and of course, I'm going to talk about one more psychologist here, Lev Vygotsky, developmental psychologist, immensely important to the study of creativity over the course of the changing brain over the course of development. And he went so far as to say any human act that gives rise to something new is referred to as a creative act, regardless of whether it is created as a physical object or some mental or emotional construct that lives within the person who created it and is only known only to him, okay? So with this, I say the significance of this focus is important because I largely went to try and propose a new definition, mainly because of the neuropsychological work. As charming as artists are, it was really the neuropsychology that led me to think it's important to think about why this happens, why this sudden flourishing of creativity sometimes and breakage in other times. So let's look at the focus of the significance of this focus for the changing creative brain and look at something that's getting a lot of focus now, which is temporarily changing your brain, disrupting it through psychedelics. There's still very limited empirical work on the topic, but the general idea is that psychedelics lead to some form of cognitive disinhibition that allows creativity to emerge. The data so far is pretty mixed. Depends on a lot of things, what kind of drug, what kind of creativity task, what's the baseline level of creativity. And also there's lots of confounding factors, including the fact that they almost never control for openness to experience, factor that in, which we know is a huge predictor of creative outcomes. And of course, there's lots of interest in psychedelics since the discovery of psychedelics. So this is like studied by Oscar Jeniger in the 1950s, an artist who's interested in knowing, I think I'm going to get better by taking psychedelics, takes psychedelics and tries and tries and tries to come up with something. And over the course of it, you know, he's very excited about what he's going to be doing, but very quickly it becomes apparent that he doesn't have any control over what he's seeing and kind of transmitting it to paper, right? He's seeing things, but he's like, what am I doing? It's not actually coming out the same way. And by the end of it, he's just really disappointed by the whole experience because he thinks having these visions are going to help him create. If you look at systematic reviews of psychedelic research, what it shows you is that there's definitely some relationship there, but it's not clear that the substance abuse directly contribute to the growth of creativity, okay? And we've known this for a long time. Why does a lot of people who use it report feeling more creative? But this doesn't bear out in results. Partly it might be because we're doing a lot of external-based focus. But this was pointed out very much in Huxley's work as well. He was one of the early experimenters with the drug. And he was asked right away, would the drug give more help to different types of artists, such as, is it more helpful for a poet compared to a novelist? And he said, well, he doesn't think so, because during the experience, you're not really interested in doing anything practical. The interviewers are pushing. They don't like this answer. They want something else. So he says, but the artist's talent won't be any different from before he took the drug. And he said, not really. Maybe if it helps people, it might help an artist with synesthesia, because they're used to seeing the world in a sort of really vivid and imaginative way anyway. So he picked on the artist Aude Lauredon, who used to make pictures like this. As it happens, we do have an impression of what Aude Lauredon saw after psychedelics, and it was this. Baseline levels matter of how creative you are, right? And he says, so you don't think there would be any relation? He says, well, there's an enormous difference in the way people respond to the drug. So some people might get something out of it, but not most. But for most people, it is an extremely significant experience. And so I suppose in an indirect way, it could help this creative process. So let's focus on this one study, which is probably, I think, the best done study so far, looking at spontaneous versus deliberate creative cognition during and after psilocybin exposure. And they were really smart in that they looked at how people's responses on something like the alternative uses task, which is the classically most widely used divergent thinking task, changes when people are doing it when they're in the psychedelic state directly during the peak experience of the drug, compared to at the afterglow phase, okay? This is kind of what they find. Let's take the AUT, come up with many uses as you can for a common object. They assess it in a number of different ways. Fluency, the total number of ideas generated. originality, uniqueness of the ideas as rated by external raters. But they had a fourth measure, which is the novelty of an idea as reported by the participants. So what they said was, I've had this idea and I've never had that. This is new to me. So this is the internal rating of the participant. I'm so sorry. So what do they see during the actual psychedelic state? Only one thing was found to be significant. Fluency drops, gets worse when you're in the psychedelic state. You're not interested in coming up with ideas. You're just interested in what you're experiencing, yeah? A week later, though, afterglow phase, what do they see? No difference on anything except self-reported novel ideas. That goes up, okay? So if we're thinking about the importance of getting the internal frame of reference in, is that we can miss out a lot if we only take the external perspective. We might think of this as completely meaningless if psychedelics don't do anything, but actually they do something quite subtle for the experiencing person, at least, even if it's not externally assessed as being great. For them, they're thinking, gosh, I'm having lots of novel things. These are new ideas that I've never had before. And that's meaningful, if we're to understand the changing brain. What about the significance of the focus for disrupted brains, okay? Now, for a long time, we've essentially followed kind of dual system as ideas when we try to understand the broken brains. So the dual systems ideas, of which there are plenty in psychology, neuroscience, and obviously creativity, is the idea is that our minds are of two types. The type, and we have a part of our mind that is bursting with passion and creativity and energy and is really zany. It's kind of like Freud's id dying to get out. And we have this calm exterior that is just inhibiting all of this passion and energy. Oh my God, thank you so much. Thank you. And this controlled side is keeping us inhibited and keeping my creative side in, okay? So the dual systems idea is very much like, the one that's prominent in creativity is divergent versus convergent. The one that's dominant in the neurosciences is the left brain, right brain idea. The right brain is the one that elicits this creative capacity. And let's start looking at some broken brains now, right? So let's look at savant syndromes, and I think all of us know what it's like. It's essentially a very, very rare condition in which is seen at a very young age typically, although you can acquire it later on under some conditions. But savant syndrome is essentially this kind of unique situation in which people have severe mental disabilities but show islands of enhanced function, okay? So what you would usually see is that the kind of abilities you see are memory-based, so kind of photographic memories. They can be incredible mathematical skills, music, and the fine arts. Thank you. I'm gonna have to drink all of that so that people had to go run up and down now for all this. Okay, so savant syndrome is strongly, essentially the disorder that it's most strongly associated with is autism, because 50% of the kids with savant syndrome have comorbidity with autism and 50% with other developmental disorders, and about 1 in 10 autistic children are diagnosed also with savant syndrome. So there's some associations with the conditions there. A really famous savant who was sort of immortalized in film was Kim Peek, who had incredible photographic memory, where he could sort of, I think when he died, he had a repository of about 12,000 books in his mind that he could recall verbatim. And he is the inspiration for the movie Rain Man. So if you look at Kim Peek's brain, this is kind of a sagittal view of what a typical brain would look like. And this is Kim Peek's brain. And what you can see is a lot, his major commissures are all kind of absent, and he has a kind of atrophied cerebellum. But essentially, all of the white matter structures aren't there, right? So this whole idea of why does, this is always seen as kind of conducive for this common theory of left brain injury leads to this evocation of right brain compensation, if you're following the left brain, right brain ideas, because not having a coliseum means the right brain can come out and do its magic. There are other kind of versions of this dualistic idea, top-down versus bottom-up processing. We know that top-down processing refers to your experience-driven, concept-driven thinking. What you know about the world informs what you're seeing in front of you. And bottom-up processing is stimulus-driven processing. So I don't have to process everything about the cup before I know that it's a cup because I've seen millions of cups before, yeah? So The other alternative theory by people like Ramachandran and all have proposed in the case of Savant syndrome, there is a breakdown in top-down modulation. So they have very little concept-driven thinking, and they have an overexpression of bottom-up processing, which means they have much more access to details that would normally be completely ignored by our perceptual systems, okay? So there's a range of different, I'm just putting them all down here, dual systems, associative executive, open mode, closed mode, generate, explore, primary process, secondary process, divergent, convergent, bottom up, top down, and so on. And then this mapping has moved on to the neuroscience domain, where we have essentially the default mode brain network as being seen as the important areas of the brain that facilitate associative function, and you have central executive networks involved in that horrible inhibition, yeah? And so what happens in the creative brains when they're disrupted is that this system gets broken, is the common thing that we think, is that this left-hand system breaks down. So let's take the case, and this is kind of proposed regardless of what's happening, right? So let's take the case of Nadia, an autistic savant, really well studied. She was without speech for the longest time, but she started to draw by the age of 3, and that was her dominant mode of expression. No speech at all, drawing, drawing, drawing. This is what Nadia could draw at the age of 5. This is what a typical 8-year-old's drawing looks like. And art experts have said that Nadia's drawings are closer to what Da Vinci was drawing in his prime, okay? So the idea was the speech aspects of her mind have obviously not developed. This has allowed for the elicitation for some other function. Let's go to frontotemporal dementia. I think this is probably what most people know about, which is a gradual atrophying of the frontalmost and the anteriormost part of the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe start to atrophy. And in a subset of these participants, of these patients, they go on to develop incredible skills post-stroke that are very, they're suddenly interested in the arts, or they've never had any training before, any interest before. And this interest is not passing. It's pretty compulsive. A lot of them actually decide to become artists after. And of course, the creativity mental illness link, which is long-standing, and I don't actually need to get into this. All of this is seen as an examples of paradoxical functional facilitation, which means that a disruption in the brain leads to an elicitation of function somewhere else. Now, paradoxical functional facilitation is true. It does exist, but it's not necessarily creative, okay? So for instance, let's take Savant syndrome. Kim Peek would not be seen as being the most creative person there. He had great memory skills, but it doesn't necessarily translate to creativity skills. The person who's talked the most about needing to distinguish what we're looking at is probably Dalia Zadel in her studies of de novo creativity. What does she say? She says, in the neurological cases, the turning to art is innovative. The produced art, however, is not necessarily creative. So what I think she means is that when this part of your system gets disrupted, what comes out is that an elicitation is there of the internal frame of reference, individual creativity, okay? But for something to be judged as creative by the vast majority of us, you need to have all systems functioning, yeah? You need to produce something that convinces a lot of people. So she's the one to draw to attention the need to consider the magnitude of creativity when we look at disrupted brains, okay? In that we might be seeing an elicitation of this internal frame of reference that's not quite reaching the mark of consensus, but that's, remember, where the ideation starts, okay? So let's look at what we do as humans. Creativity, despite our physiological limitations. We have artists here, of course, who use their functional limbs, but we have artists who create art without functional limbs. So in the 1700s, the very famous artist was Matthias Buchinger, who did incredible types of, all types of crafts with his hands, but he didn't have hands. He had stumps instead of fingers, okay? And of course, there's lots of people who, in the absence of limbs, have to start use another kind of effector for this function. So Linda Rivera is one of many foot painters, okay? So there's something about us that our limitations kind of channel us to find other ways to do what we need to do. As another example, John Bramble, he's actually blind, and he creates huge amounts of art just by using his tactile sense, okay? And he's a very prolific artist. He used to do art before he acquired his blindness. He thought he could never do it again, and he just changed the way he did it using his tactile senses more, yeah? When we look at art, we tend to think of people like Mozart, right? When we look at people with the most profound impacts in terms of our lives, in terms of how they've changed the world of creativity, we look at people like Mozart, who produced that at the age of 5, that composition. We don't think of people like Grandma Moses, who really started to paint only in her 70s and became also an incredibly prolific artist. What is missing from this picture here, and I have the printout somewhere, but I don't know where I left it, is that when people look at Mozart, they think this comes quickly, it's obvious, it's easy, and they don't have to work for it. And it's the opposite of the truth. He had to work really, really hard to be Mozart and not just another musician. And it's really well documented what he did, including in his own letters. He essentially deformed his own hands with the amount of composition that he was doing in the short amount of time that he had. And what he brings through the whole time is his drive, that he was driven, and he was like trained that way, and he was just driven to want to do this, yeah? That internal frame of reference, more than anything, was what guided his vision, okay? So we really need to really think very carefully when we're looking at creativity, what is it that we're judging, and what is it that we're not judging? In the case of disrupted brains, we see this really clearly. So this is a very famous example from a beautiful study by Seeley way back in 2008, when he looked at the artist Anne Adams, who developed primary progressive aphasia, a certain kind of somatic dementia. And we have scans of her brain before she was showing any symptoms, because when she was younger, she had like a benign tumor on her auditory nerve, and that had to be removed. So she had to get her brain scanned ever so often. And what we have is sort of a snapshot of how her brain went from neurotypical to gradually atrophying, and we have a snapshot of the typical kind of art she was producing then. And while her brain is atrophying, her capacity for communication verbally is, of course, being destroyed, but her art continues and continues and continues, okay? And she's not alone. We have brain data for her, but this is not unusual at all. If you look at all of the collections of neurological disorders in artists, it is remarkable how many of them continue to produce. They might be slightly less productive, they might change styles, they might change mediums, yeah? But they continue to produce art. So I've argued in works for thinking about this as a kind of damage-resistant capacity of the brain to create. Because, and I don't, you know, it's an open question what the adaptive role of such a feature would be. Dalia Zadel says it's the drive to communicate. There are other options that I've put there. But it's clear that it comes about because it starts very early. It starts like with that little kid. It started when we were a few months old. If you've been around any child, it starts with exploration. It starts with curiosity. And this is deeply encoded in our brains, okay? As a final thing, maybe I should get into this. This is a new study that is trying to map out and trying to make us understand why it is in these cases that we have sometimes paradoxical increases in creativity, right? So what they did is to essentially try to see, does creativity map onto a specific brain circuit, and does it align with creativity changes that occurs during brain disease, all right? It was a huge study, and what they basically found, strangely, I think really, really new, quite unexpected, at least when I saw this first, I was like, this is kind of really unusual, causes us to rethink a lot. I think it provides us new theoretical standpoints to start from here. But essentially, that the brain regions activated by creative tasks map onto a circuit that is defined by negative functional connectivity to this anterior-most part of the brain, the right temporal pole, okay? And creativity changes observed in individuals with brain damage is essentially seen in a very specific way in this network. So I'm just going to show you as a last piece of evidence what they did. They looked at 36 studies published over a long period of functional activations that came about due to engaging in the tasks like the AUT. Again, it's very different what you see in the neuropsychological side. Very rarely is that studied. We're just looking for artistic expression typically. So that's one of the weaknesses. But they looked at the different studies that were looking at tasks, typically divergent thinking tasks, which areas were activated, mapped them all out onto a common area, then correlated those peak activations to resting state functional connectivity to see which of these areas How are they connected with one another? And essentially, they looked at all sorts of sensitivity tests and specificity tests, and they found that the right frontal pole was consistently associated with negative connectivity to the areas that are classically found. Okay, so it's kind of like it's modulating it in a really unusual way. So the right frontal pole here in green, you see in blue the areas that are positively associated with connectivity there. In red, the ones that are negatively associated with connectivity to the frontal pole. And in the dots here, you see those functional activations from those 36 studies they looked at, and independent studies of those 30 further studies. And you see that by and large, those activation peak activations fall in the roaring red and yellow areas. What does this mean for brain disorders, though? This is kind of what they found. So this is, they took one of my studies there, an old study where I looked at a number of different patient groups who showed either no differences, some deficits, some enhancements, or only enhancements. Yeah, so I'm just going to focus on, let's say, the frontal lobe group that had huge amounts of lesions throughout the frontal lobe, were pretty much bad on almost every creativity task. And that maps onto their circuit here. Whereas the frontopolar group, who performed no differently on any of the tasks and performed better on one aspect of creative cognition, their lesion mapping falls into this blue area, okay? They also looked at other studies that looked at essentially de novo creativity. So these are all sorts of neuropsychological patients that have been looked at. SVPPA is the semantic variation of the primary progressive aphasia. BVFTD is the behavioral variant of the frontotemporal dementia. And let's go to the non-fluent variation of PPA. All the others there have also been studied: Alzheimer's disease, logopenic PPA, Parkinson's disease, and so on. Consistently, the two disorders, the subset of groups that are seen with enhanced creative function, if you look at their atrophy peaks, they fall into those blue regions that are positively related, connected to the right frontal pole. Whereas if you look at the group that is always seen as lower performance on creativity, their atrophy peaks are within the red regions that are negatively correlated, okay? What this exactly means for everything is interesting to me, given the role of the right frontal pole in relational integration and essentially integrating the function of multiple cognitive operations. But it's our first peek of how we're kind of using, bringing it all together, using functional neuroimaging, using the brain data to try and map them all out together to come up with common theories that explain what we see across all these methods that has not been done before. Okay, I think, do you want me to have 5 questions? With that, I have way more that I won't be able to get into. But ultimately, I want to just leave you with a question of when we think about why are we creative, that is a big question. That the functional aspect of why we are, how we are, and why we have been this way for tens of thousands of years. This is the oldest cave art ever found, has dated back to about 44,000 years in Indonesia. That's how long we have been doing this of our own accord in little caves, just trying to express ourselves. We've always been in love with our own self-expressions. This is like how selfies used to be done, apparently. This is from 11,000 years ago. But it's not enough that we do it. We create ways to make art. This is a bone flute from about 35,000 years ago. You just have to imagine what humanoid reached out to a vulture bone, blew through it, heard some noise, and thought, oh, this is interesting. And it goes on to become an instrument that we all use, and not all. Well, doesn't everyone use a flute? No. But essentially, I want us to think about all of the factors that we're missing out on if we don't consider the internal perspective of why we create, why we're silly, why we're trying to engage a response that goes beyond novelty and is much more experiential, much more about reflecting on not just our cognitive minds, but also our emotional drives, yeah? Think of us as the Homo sapiens. It stands for the wise being, essentially, the wise man. And wisdom, from people who do wisdom research, has shown us that wisdom is reflected in both components. It's not just about cognition and reasoning. It is about heart. It is about feeling. And that is central to the creative process. So I hope what it shows, all this work on the changing brains has shown us is essentially pulling back the humanity into what we create. Understanding ourselves as humans first that have thinking brains, but also feeling minds. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that really compelling talk. And we will not have time for questions, but we do have time for a quick break. And also, I just want to mention that that really great psychedelic paper that you mentioned was written by Natasha Mason, who is one of the tireless members of our organizing committee. So feel free to chat with her about it. So we're going to take 5 minutes. Please come back in 5 minutes. And if you are one of the speakers in this next session, please come down to the front.